This is going to be the first of a series of videos that I'll be making where I talk about ideas I have for the upcoming Naruto game, namely Storm Connections, which I think at this point, with its title being trademarked, I think it's pretty safe to say that the rumors are probably true. If you want to be skeptical about it, that's fine, but for me personally, I've been holding back on talking about this for too long, and at this point, I'm tired of pretending like it's still just a theory or a rumor, and I want to talk in great detail about it. Now, if you ask most people today what they want from a new Naruto game, it's usually two things, either an ArcSys 2D fighter or an open world game similar to Kakarot. Now, I do believe that Arc System Works will eventually dive into licensed IPs. I don't know if Naruto will be one of them, although regardless of what it might be, I think it's important for people to remember that Arc System Works is also a publisher and they have other games that they work on. They're not just known for Dragon Ball Fighters, they do other stuff. So I don't think people should act as if they're expected to develop a new fighting game based off of a manga or anime IP. As far as an open world game, I actually do believe that Storm Connections is still a viable candidate for this, even if I will admit that in the last few years, it certainly doesn't feel like it has been much of a priority for the Ultimate Ninja games. I think people forget that there was actually a time when Cyber Connect 2 were kinda rocking it when it came to the open world in the past Naruto games. The first game that they ever introduced one was Ultimate Ninja 2, and at that point in time, it wasn't anything special. It had fixed camera angles, and it generally didn't feel that expanded, but it was also their first step, and you have to keep in mind that this came out after they had developed a game in which the story campaign had a bare-bone, almost visual novel levels of presentation, with no in-game cutscenes and world setting to navigate. So it was a big deal to see a rendered open world that reflected the stages that we were used to seeing every time we fought during matches, and in its own unique way made their transitions feel more immersive. Ultimate Ninja 3 took things to the next level by introducing a 3D environment thanks to one of my favorite modes in all of the Ultimate Ninja games, namely Ultimate Contest. This mode was great not just because of the competitive nature of the tournament that slowly became a subtle collective endeavor in which the majority of the people there were just rooting for Naruto because of how committed he was, to the point where some just voluntarily gave away their crystals, not just because of how the mode mixed things up with different minigames without making them feel drawn out and the amount of scrolls that you can collect at your own leisure, but also because Konoha itself looked more well realized. It's a squared map, but it has multiple buildings that you can freely run and jump towards. The freedom of movement isn't to be underappreciated, and despite the population not being very dense, you can still interact with some villagers, with all of them being fully voice acted, and some recognizable characters being located in specific spots. It's safe to say that there was plenty of improvement found in this game. Where it becomes a little more debatable is with Ultimate Ninja 4. Now, as a matter of fact, I actually do think that the fourth entry is a superior one, but there are some caveats. For one, the map feels a lot more linear than before. In Ultimate Contest, the open nature of it allowed you to travel to one location in multiple directions. With Ultimate Ninja 4, the paths feel a lot more streamlined. If you want to go to the training field, for example, you really only have one route to take. So it could emit a feeling of being limited. However, when you're able to overlook this, I actually do believe you will find Ultimate Ninja 4 to have an improved open world. The locations look prettier, partially because they went with a more anime aesthetic than before, and there was a noticeable improvement in the graphics. You can always sense a shift in the atmosphere depending on where you're located, partially because of the music being played, but also because of the environment surrounding you. Like how if you go outside, you'll be met with random encounters. The fact that they even have a different 3D arena combat system makes the experience feel more unique than the typical 2.5D matches. There are some other little gimmicks like the ability to body flick, which can even be crucial for passing through certain locations. Now, Ultimate Ninja 5 is functionally identical when it comes to the scope of the open world. There's honestly not a ton of differences that exist between the two, except maybe some removal and additions of minor to somewhat relevant mechanics. To me, Ultimate Ninja 5 represents the peak of the Ultimate Ninja game's open world, but I'm sure there's the question of whether or not the crown should go to Storm 1. And in some ways, I can somewhat see the argument. Storm 1's Konoha is by far the largest and most detailed out of all the Ultimate Ninja games, and with the improved graphics of the PlayStation 3 generation, it certainly is tempting to say that it's the best. However, when I take a closer look at the content that is provided, it's really not a lot. For one, it does have some disadvantages over the previous games, namely the fact that it has no voice acting. The activity in the village functions independently of the progress of the story because there's barely any. The challenges can be fun to complete. I do like the tree climbing minigames. Hide and seek can certainly be amusing to play at times, But in the end, the game doesn't really feel like it took full advantage of the open world. It also doesn't help that this game came out around the same time Ubisoft had also developed two open world Naruto games, in which Konoha was much more detailed, much bigger, much more interesting to observe the relationship status between Naruto and the village. The game did a pretty decent job adapting the story of part 1, minus some of the filler, and you could go outside of Konoha and explore the world beyond it. I can't help but look at these two series of games as competing with each other. And to be frank, Ubisoft won when it came to how interesting the open world was, which is a shame given how much CyberConnect 2, despite never having the pinnacle of full open world design, still managed to create the world of Naruto in ways that felt exciting at the point in time with the amount of content that they were diving into. And as the years progressed, things only got worse. Storm 2 and 3 presented limitations in the open world explanation that hit new records in the franchise. In some locations, or in most of them to be honest, the cameras were fixed, you could no longer double jump, the amount of interactivity with items was dramatically reduced. Overall, it felt like we were walking several steps backwards in our progress in the open world development. There are a few reasons we can theorize for why this decision was made. The most agreed one is that they were saving the resources for improving the boss battles and the depth of the story campaign. I have my own little theory that because these games were also developed for the Xbox 360, it's possible that in the first game they were using a specific method for offloading some of the processing and rendering work to the SPEs, which they could no longer rely on due to the different architecture of the Xbox compared to the PlayStation 3, which this was originally exclusive to. But there's no way I would be able to prove that. That's definitely something I would be interested in asking CyberConnect 2 if it's the case or not. Regardless, the inferior open world was never enough to significantly hurt the quality of the game simply because the story campaign was strong enough to carry those games, and I was personally pleased with the aesthetic of the backgrounds, looking closely reminiscent to anime backgrounds, and there were some locations that did have a 3D environment, some of them being locations for stages, which made the transition to the matches feel more immersive, something that even Storm 1 never quite accomplished. Though this was definitely the point in time when CyberConnect 2 started to isolate their priorities more, and when it came to Storm 4, despite being developed for stronger hardware, the quality of the open world didn't improve that much. In fact, in general, it actually got worse as both Adventure Mode and Road to Boruto have limited exploration with more restrictive movements, not even being able to jump, and for traveling to outside of Konoha, you now had to rely on fast travels instead of traveling through forests or deserts to get to other villages. I honestly think that it was the last few games that increased people's urges to witness a good open world Naruto game because of how long it had been since we saw a proper one, and also the release of Dragon Ball Z Kakarot and One Piece World Seeker, which reminded us of how breathtaking it can be to see fictional universes that we recognize being adapted on a large scale. Now, because video game production has gotten more overbearing and exhausting to code and debug, it doesn't necessarily surprise me that the Storm games, with them being primarily fighting games, wouldn't have the open world aspect treated with large priority, and I think that in general it makes sense. However, with Century Japan claiming that this is likely going to be one of the best anime games ever released, I think if there's one thing they could introduce that would put it above a lot of other anime games out there is to introduce a more ambitious open world scene that expanded the appeal of the game beyond just the fighting. And there is actually one thing that convinces me that they could pull it off, and that is the newer generation of consoles. Now I will say that if this becomes a cross-gen game, then unfortunately this reason I have doesn't really apply, because one benefit of the newer gaming consoles is the fast SSD. You see, one might argue that because there wasn't much improvement when entering the 8th generation, that there's no guarantee that we'll see a different story with these new platforms. But the reason why I'm hopeful is because when it came to the difference between the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4's hard drive, the only notable difference is the max size and speed increase when you inject a third-party SSD. Other than that, with both systems, the PlayStation 4 is definitely faster. I believe the PlayStation 3, at least the earlier models, had read speeds of like 40 megabytes, which is almost 8 times faster than the PlayStation 2 game, while the PlayStation 4, I think it's sub 100, although both of them have 5400 of RPM, so essentially what I'm trying to say is that the improvement wasn't really that notable. I mean, the fact that both the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 relied on mechanical hard drives was already a bummer, but to add even more drawbacks, they were also using pretty underwhelming AMD Jaguar CPUs with piss poor clock speeds. However, the newer consoles are based on Zen 2, having 8 cores and 16 threads, which I can imagine would help in processing assets in the game, and with their NVMe SSDs, which are far better than the storage drives we had before, well above 10 times their speed, I honestly believe that this can help in fleshing out the world without worrying about the limitations of the platform and trying to optimize the game to cater to that. Now, what are some additions that we can expect to see? Well, I have my own suggestions. For one, there needs to be more agility. Storm 4 reached peak levels of limited movements by not even allowing you to do minimal jumps. This can't continue to happen. I want a revival of double jumps. There needs to be ways for the characters to jump through buildings, maybe do something similar to what Storm 1 did, in which some buildings had specific spots for walking through the walls. Maybe there's a specific mechanic that allows you to walk on top of water and buildings at the cost of a specific meter. We also need to see more ninja gimmicks, like how the PlayStation 2 Ultimate Ninja games had timed jumps that allowed one of your shadow clones to throw you further away by tapping triangle when shown on screen. Or Storm 1 had the launching cannon. We can also see body flicking, and that would be pretty cool. And when I say that I want these things, I don't just mean they need to be in the game for funsies, it also needs to be relevant for advancing missions, having a more platformer appeal. Now, when it comes to the world design, I actually like the aesthetic of Konoha in Storm 4. I think overall it looks really good, and where I would mainly want improvements on is, for one, less loading sequences between different areas, which I do believe they can improve on this because of the faster SSD. I also want a bit more interactivity with the world in question, have more villagers that we can interact with for some small dialogue, more side missions, and to the extent that they can, more places that you can enter, which would definitely be a huge W because during the Boruto era, some of the stores in Konoha are run by recognizable characters from original Naruto, so it's a perfect opportunity for providing fan service. As far as outside of Konoha, since I'm not very familiar with the story of Boruto, I can't speak on behalf of areas to explore. What I will say is that it would be really cool if they could revive random encounters, although I do wish for the combat system to be a bit different compared to normal matches, kind of like how in Storm 3, mob battles work differently than regular matches, despite both of them being open arena battles. Now, I don't find this next option to be too important, but if they can, they could also introduce a skill tree, but if that's too overwhelming, I don't mind being cut off. There are some other things that are on my mind, like the fact that a lot of anime games, there's this tendency for cutscenes to vary in quality, some of them being of higher quality while others having minimal animation and scene presentation. The Storm games are also guilty of this, and while it would be cool for the quality of the animation to be consistent, I find this to be an incredibly unlikely scenario. The truth is, this is the standard for a lot of Japanese games, and honestly, it doesn't really bother me that much. I just feel like pointing this out because CyberConnect 2 actually do put a concentrated effort to amp up their cutscenes, and it would certainly be nice to see more progress in this department, but it's not a make it or break it. I can put up with some cheaper looking cutscenes every once in a while. Also, this goes without saying, Storm Connections needs to be 60 frames per second. I'm sorry, if I'm going to explore the world of Naruto, I would rather not have them lock the game to 30 like we're stuck in the Stone Age. I don't even think that's gonna happen, especially if this game becomes a next-gen exclusive. Although, if it does get released as a cross-gen game, at the very least, don't make us wait months for a 60 FPS patch to arrive. No one is gonna wait that long to play the story campaign or the game as a whole, so please, for the love of God, no more cucking us like that. Other things I could mention, I mean, it would certainly be cool if we got more minigames, but I don't know how feasible that would be, so I wouldn't really mind if there wasn't much focus on that. I'm debating whether or not they could include content later down the line to add supplementary material, but honestly, I think it would be better suited for DLC characters and balance updates. Also, if the DLC content in question is adding more story portions from the manga, I would much prefer if that kind of stuff was reserved for future titles instead of bloating up the current one. So I think overall, those are the essentials for me at least. Now, there is a question of whether or not it's reasonable to expect Storm Connections to have a compelling open world experience. It really depends on which perspective you're coming from. As a fighting game, I would make the argument that you don't even need a story campaign to begin with. A dedicated competitive community is more than enough to keep the game hanging. So as long as the game has a good online infrastructure, routine updates, and a cast of characters that people are interested in maining and getting better, then yeah, you really don't need any story campaign. However, I would make the argument that a huge reason for why people are invested in the Storm games is because of the story mode. And in the past, they were doing interesting things with their open world game modes, so I would say yes, it is somewhat reasonable to have high expectations for the future of the open world. If anything, I feel like it would ease up some people's frustrations because even though in general a new Storm game is highly demanded, I've also seen some people that say that they don't want one. They want either a 2D fighter or an open world game like Kakarot. But if you offer a good open world experience with the new Storm games, it will at least satisfy one side of the pushback crowd. And me personally, while I do like the Storm games, I started off with the PlayStation 2 games, and I have a hard nostalgia for the old games. I also find it sad that the best version of Konoha has been unrivaled for 15 years. No one has been able to beat Ubisoft's adaptation of the Hidden Leaf Village. And look, this can't go on forever. Someone has to take the crown, and I have faith that CyberConnect 2 could be the one to dethrone them. I just hope that they have enough resources to pull that off. Of course, I'm coming from a biased perspective as someone who mostly favors the single player campaigns, but I do also have an interest in fighting games, which is why in my next few videos I will cover the mechanics of the games in their own isolated topics of discussion, so stay tuned for that. Other than that, I think that's all I have to say. Hope you're doing well.